The Plague of Justinian. In the year 541 CE, ships slipped quietly into the harbors of Constantinople, their hulls heavy with Egyptian grain. The empire was at its height under Emperor Justinian I, who dreamed of restoring Roman glory across the Mediterranean. But hidden among the sacks of wheat were black rats, and on those rats, fleas. Within weeks, the capital of the Byzantine Empire began to change. Citizens first noticed fever and sudden fatigue. Then came the swellings, dark, painful lumps in the groin and armpits. Some victims slipped into delirium, others collapsed in the streets. At its peak, thousands were said to die each day in Constantinople alone. The emperor himself fell ill, hovering between life and death, while carts creaked endlessly through avenues once filled with merchants and soldiers. Mass graves overflowed. When the pits ran out, bodies were stacked in towers inside city walls. Trade halted, armies stalled, fields went unharvested. Across the Mediterranean world, from North Africa to Italy, the contagion followed trade routes like an invisible army. Modern scholars largely attribute the outbreak to Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium later blamed for the Black Death, yet the scale and recurrence of the Justinianic plague remain debated. Climate shifts, volcanic winters, and grain shipments may have amplified its spread, creating conditions ripe for catastrophe. What is certain is its consequence. Justinian's ambitious campaigns to reclaim the Western Roman territories faltered. Tax revenues collapsed, military recruitment withered. Some historians argue this pandemic marked the true beginning of the empire's slow contraction, leaving it vulnerable to future invasions. Over the next 2 centuries, waves of the plague would return, carving demographic scars across Europe and the Near East. It did not merely kill, it altered momentum. An empire poised to dominate the Mediterranean instead turned inward, weakened not by swords, but by microbes too small to see. The plague of Justinian reminds us that history's turning points are not always battles or treaties. Sometimes they arrive quietly in the belly of a grain ship, and by the time the bells begin to toll, the course of civilization has already shifted. Smallpox in the Americas. In 1519, Spanish ships cut across the waters of the Gulf Coast and anchored near the edges of a vast and sophisticated world. When Hernán Cortés marched inland toward the heart of the Aztec Empire, he did not arrive alone. Invisible particles traveled with his men, on their breath, in their clothing, within their blood. Smallpox had crossed the Atlantic. At first, it appeared as fever and exhaustion among indigenous communities who had never encountered the virus before. Then came the rash. Blisters spread across faces and bodies, filling with fluid, hardening into scabs that cracked and bled. Entire households fell silent within days. With no prior exposure, there was no immunity. The mortality was staggering. In some regions, more than half the population perished in a single wave. Leaders died, priests died, farmers, artisans, warriors, whole social structures unraveled. When smallpox reached Tenochtitlan, it struck during a critical moment of resistance. The emperor, Cuitlahawak, succumbed to the disease, leaving the city politically fractured as Spanish forces regrouped. To the south, the virus moved along trade routes and mountain paths, reaching the mighty Inca Empire even before Europeans arrived in force. Civil war erupted there after the death of Emperor Huayna Capac, destabilizing the empire just as conquistadors advanced. The devastation was not confined to battlefields. Fields went untilled. Famine followed disease. Oral histories describe villages where the living were too few to bury the dead. Some survivors believe the gods had abandoned them. Others believe the strangers possessed supernatural power. In truth, microbes were accomplishing what steel alone could not. Historians estimate that within a century of contact, tens of millions across the Americas had died from smallpox and other Eurasian diseases. The demographic collapse reshaped continents. European colonization accelerated, not solely because of superior weapons, but because societies had been hollowed out from within. The Great Dying of the Americas remains one of the most profound biological exchanges in human history, an unintended consequence of exploration that redrew maps, erased civilizations, and altered the balance of power between hemispheres. It was not a single battle that decided the fate of empires. It was a virus carried across an ocean against which an entire world had no defense. The Spanish flu. In the final months of World War I, as artillery thundered across Europe and millions of soldiers huddled in muddy trenches, another enemy began moving through the ranks, silent, efficient, and impossible to negotiate with. In early 1918, reports surfaced of a strange influenza spreading rapidly through military camps. At first, it seemed ordinary: fever, aches, exhaustion. But this strain was different. Young, healthy soldiers, men in their 20s and 30s, were collapsing within hours. Their skin turned blue from lack of oxygen, lungs filled with fluid. Some bled from the nose and ears before suffocating. Field hospitals overflowed. Nurses watched as patients who had been speaking in the morning were dead by nightfall. Troop ships crossing the Atlantic became floating incubators, carrying the virus from continent to continent. Because wartime censorship suppressed reports in many nations, neutral Spain's open coverage gave the pandemic its misleading name, the Spanish flu. By the time the war ended, the virus had already circled the globe. Cities from Philadelphia to Mumbai saw mass graves dug in parks. Public gatherings were banned. Schools closed. Masks became mandatory in some regions. The death toll climbed with terrifying speed, tens of millions within a single year. Unlike typical influenza, this H1N1 strain triggered what scientists now call a cytokine storm, an immune overreaction that turned the body against itself. The stronger the immune system, the more violent the response. Entire families vanished within days. In some villages, there were not enough healthy people left to tend the sick. Economies staggered. Life expectancy in the United States alone dropped by more than a decade in 1918. And yet, despite its scale, the pandemic slipped into the shadow of the war that coincided with it. There were no monuments, no victory parades, only absence. Modern epidemiology would later study preserved lung samples to decode its genetic structure, seeking answers to why it was so lethal and why its deadliest wave struck with such force in the autumn of 1918. The Spanish flu did not reshape borders the way treaties did, but it reshaped public health forever. Governments began building national surveillance systems. International cooperation on disease tracking slowly emerged. The world learned at immense cost that in an age of global transport and industrial war, a virus could move faster than armies. It was a pandemic born in the trenches of modernity, and it revealed just how fragile modernity truly was. The Antonine Plague. In 165 CE, Roman soldiers returning from campaigns in the East marched back into the heart of an empire that believed itself eternal. They carried spoils of war, stories of distant provinces, and something far more destructive. As legions passed through cities of the vast Roman Empire, a strange illness followed. It began with fever and sore throat. Then came eruptions across the skin, pustules that spread over the body, scabbing and scarring those who survived. Many did not. Contemporary accounts describe victims suffering from relentless diarrhea, dehydration, and delirium. At its height, thousands were said to die each day in Rome. The outbreak unfolded during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, a ruler remembered for calm philosophical reflections, yet forced to govern amid relentless mortality. Farms emptied as peasants died or fled. Trade slowed along the empire's intricate road networks. Military recruitment faltered just as external pressures mounted along the frontiers. Some historians believe the disease was smallpox. Others argue measles. What is certain is that it cut deeply into the empire's manpower, perhaps claiming 5 to 10 million lives over more than a decade. Entire legions weakened, border defenses thinned, economic strain intensified as tax revenues shrank and prices rose. Temples filled with citizens seeking divine explanation, offerings made to gods who remained silent. For many Romans, the plague was not merely biological, it was spiritual, a sign that the pact between empire and destiny had fractured. The demographic blow may have marked the beginning of a longer pattern of vulnerability. While Rome did not fall in that century, the Antonine Plague exposed its fragility. An empire built on expansion depended on constant movement, troops, goods, people, and that very connectivity became its weakness. The disease traveled the same roads that once symbolized Roman dominance. In the end, no invading army breached the gates during those years. Instead, an invisible pathogen infiltrated barracks and villas alike, altering the trajectory of imperial strength. The Antonine Plague stands as one of the earliest recorded pandemics in Western history, a moment when even the most powerful state on Earth discovered that conquest offered no immunity against nature. The third cholera pandemic. In the mid-19th century, as steamships cut through rivers and railways stitched continents together, a different kind of passenger moved with them. It began in the Ganges Delta of India, where dense populations and monsoon floods created the perfect conditions for contamination. From there, cholera followed trade routes outward, across Asia, into the Middle East, and deep into Europe. By 1854, London was gripped by fear. Entire neighborhoods emptied as families fled the stench of sickness. The disease struck with terrifying speed. Victims who seemed healthy in the morning were by afternoon writhing in agony, seized by violent vomiting and relentless diarrhea. Their bodies lost fluids so rapidly that skin shrank against bone, lips turned blue, and eyes sank into hollow sockets. Death could come within hours. Many believed the cause was miasma, poisoned air drifting through filthy streets. But one physician, John Snow, doubted the prevailing theory. In the Soho district, he traced cases house by house, mapping infections to a single public water pump on Broad Street. When he persuaded officials to remove the pump handle, the outbreak subsided. It was a quiet revolution. Though skepticism remained, the idea that contaminated water, not bad air, spread cholera began reshaping medical science. Meanwhile, the pandemic continued its global sweep, claiming over 1 million lives. In cities from Paris to New York, fear of invisible contamination forced governments to confront their own neglect. Sewage systems were redesigned, urban sanitation projects expanded. Modern public health infrastructure began to take form, not out of enlightenment, but necessity. Cholera exposed the cost of industrial progress without planning. Crowded tenements and polluted water supplies had turned prosperity into vulnerability. Unlike plagues of antiquity, this pandemic unfolded in an age of newspapers and statistics, allowing patterns to be studied in real time. It marked a turning point. Disease was no longer only a mystery to endure, but a phenomenon to investigate. The third cholera pandemic did more than kill. It transformed how societies understood contagion. From it emerged epidemiology as a discipline grounded in data and observation. The lesson was stark. In a connected industrial world, survival depended not on superstition or isolation, but on infrastructure, science, in the recognition that the health of a city flowed through its water as surely as its commerce. HIV/AIDS. In the summer of 1981, doctors in Los Angeles and New York began noticing something unsettling. Young men, previously healthy, were arriving in hospitals with rare infections and aggressive cancers typically seen only in patients with severely weakened immune systems. Pneumonia that refused to respond to treatment, purple lesions spreading across the skin, bodies wasting away without explanation. At first, it was labeled GRID, gay-related immune deficiency, reflecting both confusion and stigma. But the illness did not remain confined to one community. It spread silently, through blood, through sexual contact, from mother to child. By 1983, researchers had identified the virus responsible, HIV. What followed was not a sudden explosion like influenza, but a slow-burning global catastrophe. Unlike plagues that killed within days, HIV dismantled the immune system over years, leaving victims vulnerable to infections that would otherwise be harmless. Hospitals filled, funeral homes overflowed, entire communities were hollowed out, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where access to treatment was limited. Governments were slow to respond. Fear and prejudice shaped early policies more than science. Activist groups like ACT UP forced pharmaceutical companies and public health agencies to accelerate research and drug approval, demanding visibility for those dying in silence. By the 1990s, combination antiretroviral therapy transformed HIV from a death sentence to a manageable chronic condition, if treatment was available. Yet the toll had already reached into the tens of millions. The pandemic reshaped medicine, ethics, and activism. It changed how blood was screened, how sex education was taught, how clinical trials were conducted. It forced conversations about sexuality, discrimination, and global inequality onto the world stage. Unlike ancient plagues, HIV did not vanish after a wave. It remains, persistent and evolving. But it also catalyzed one of the most significant scientific mobilizations in modern history, leading to breakthroughs in virology and immunology that continue to influence research today. The HIV/AIDS pandemic revealed a different kind of vulnerability, not just biological, but social. It showed how stigma can spread faster than a virus, and how silence can be as deadly as infection. In confronting it, the world learned that fighting disease requires more than medicine. It demands compassion, coordination, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths. COVID-19. In late 2019, hospitals in Wuhan began reporting clusters of pneumonia with no clear cause. Patients struggled to breathe. Scans revealed lungs clouded and white, as if filled with frost. Within weeks, a novel coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, was identified. By the time borders began to close, the virus had already boarded international flights, moving silently between continents. In January 2020, cities locked down, streets emptied, airports fell quiet. For the first time in generations, billions of people were told to stay home. The world paused. Hospitals in northern Italy overflowed. In New York, refrigerated trucks lined hospital entrances to store the dead. Doctors reused protective equipment. Nurses held phones to patients' ears so families could say goodbye through screens. Unlike influenza, COVID-19 carried an unpredictable profile. Some experienced only mild symptoms. Others deteriorated rapidly, oxygen levels collapsing without warning. The elderly were especially vulnerable, but no age group was untouched. Scientists raced to decode the virus's genome, sharing data across borders at unprecedented speed. Within a year, mRNA vaccines were developed and deployed, an achievement once thought impossible on such a timeline. Yet the pandemic exposed fractures beneath globalization. Supply chains buckled. Misinformation spread as rapidly as the pathogen itself. Debates over masks, mandates, and vaccines revealed deep political divides. Economies contracted, schools closed, work migrated into living rooms and video calls. Millions died worldwide, and many more faced long-term complications, now known as long COVID. Even after waves subsided, the psychological imprint remained, an awareness that modern systems, for all their complexity, could still be disrupted by a microscopic strand of RNA. COVID-19 did not topple empires, but it redefined normalcy. It accelerated technological shifts, reshaped public health policy, and reminded humanity that connectivity is both strength and vulnerability. The virus emerged quietly, in one city, in one season. Within months, it had rewritten daily life across the planet. Proof that in the 21st century, distance offers no protection, and history can still turn on the breath of a stranger.
The Black Death. In 1347, merchant vessels drifted into the Sicilian port of Messina after months along Mediterranean trade routes. Sailors staggered onto the docks, feverish and disoriented, dark swellings rising beneath their arms and along their necks. Many were already dead before the ships were secured. Within days, the sickness spilled into the city streets. Bells tolled without pause. Houses were marked. Whispers turned to panic as the illness moved with unnatural speed. What began at the edges of Europe soon surged inland, following roads and rivers, riding caravans and cargo. By the time it reached Paris, London, and Florence, entire districts were collapsing. Victims developed sudden chills, searing fevers, and painful buboes that blackened the skin. Some coughed blood, others fell into delirium and died within 2 or 3 days. Physicians prescribed bloodletting, herbs, even powdered gemstones. None slowed its advance. Carts rolled through narrow alleys collecting bodies stacked upon one another. When graveyards overflowed, mass pits were dug. The smell of decay clung to the air. It is now widely attributed to the bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas on rats. Its velocity and mortality have long puzzled historians. In some regions, mortality reached 1 in 3, in others, even higher. Trade networks that once symbolized prosperity became channels of annihilation. Fear bred suspicion. Minorities were scapegoated. In cities like Strasbourg, violence erupted against Jewish communities accused of poisoning wells. Across Europe, labor systems fractured as peasants died in the fields. Surviving workers demanded higher wages. Feudal bonds weakened. The authority of institutions, both political and religious, was shaken as prayers went unanswered and clergy perished alongside commoners. And yet, amid devastation, transformation took root. Arts grew darker, preoccupied with mortality. Medicine slowly shifted toward observation over superstition. Economies adapted to scarcity. By the early 1350s, the initial wave subsided, though the plague would return in cycles for centuries. Its origins remain debated, possibly tracing back through Central Asia along Silk Road routes before erupting into Europe. But beyond its epidemiology lies its deeper legacy. The Black Death did more than kill tens of millions. It disrupted the medieval order, accelerated social change, and altered the trajectory of a continent. It arrived unseen in the holds of ships, but what it left behind was visible everywhere, in abandoned villages, in rising wages, in art obsessed with death. An invisible bacterium had shifted the balance of history, reminding humanity that even the mightiest civilizations rest on fragile biological ground.